Good afternoon, and welcome to ESSEC Knowledge Live. During this webcast series, ESSEC professors take a look at what's happening in the news and share their expert opinion. As it's live, don't hesitate to post your questions and we will answer them over the course of the show. In January 2019, the World Economic Forum will host its annual meeting in Davos. According to the WEF, we are in a time of unprecedented uncertainty, fragility, and controversy, and we are fast approaching a new phase of global cooperation. As such, the theme for the upcoming conference is Globalization 4.0, shaping a global architecture in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Today we're here with Professor Estefania Santacreu-Vasut, who will shed some light on the economic concept of the nature of goods and discuss why the theme chosen by the WEF is so important in what seems to be the age of anti-globalization. Thank you, Estefania, for being with us.
Thank you, Danielle.
Estefania is a professor of economics and holds a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley, USA. Her research studies the roles of institutions, culture, and language for economic development and gender inequality. She's been visiting professor at UC Berkeley and is co-leader of the project Gender and Finance. Today, in just about everything we see in the news, the questions of globalization are on the forefront of the conversation. Could you tell us more about how basic economic theory supports globalization?
Thank you, Daniel. So when we think about globalization, we think about flows of goods, we think about trade, we think about flows of people, we think about migration, we think about flows of capital or investment, and importantly, we think about flows of ideas or knowledge. And if we think about how globalization works, we know that the role of institutions plays a big part. In my research, I've extensively studied how institutions may help or difficult these knowledge flows. In particular, for example, with Professor Teshima Atitam, we have studied how foreign employees vehicle knowledge through multinational corporations, and they are complementary to capital investments. So when we think about globalization, it's important that we integrate these flows together, how they complement each other, in our analysis of the spillovers that these flows have for the domestic economy. Ideas in particular play an important role because ideas are what we call non-rival. And this means that the use of an idea by one person doesn't decrease the ability of another person to use it. Exploring the nature of goods, ideas, migration flows is something that I've been also trying to communicate in a recent book that I've co-written with Tom Gamble, who is a novelist, and that I'm happy to tell you more about later.
Thank you for that introduction. For those of us who have just joined us, don't forget this is a live broadcast, so feel free to post any of your questions in the live chat. For the first question that I'd like to ask you, Estefania, why do you think the WEF chose this theme, and why is it so important now?
The World Economic Forum recognizes that we are in a transformative phase of globalization, and it also recognizes that despite the opportunities that technologies can give the world, there is a recent backlash against openness. We see it in different countries with the idea that closing borders may be welfare enhancing. And in that sense, the World Economic Forum is going to discuss economic factors, but is also going to discuss the narratives behind globalization or anti-globalization, taking into account the multidimensional aspects of globalization, as we were talking before, labor, goods, migration, and so on, but also these multiple narratives that citizens, politicians, economic actors are giving to this phenomenon.
Okay. And if we don't succeed in the globalization efforts, what are some of the negative effects of anti-globalization that one may not anticipate?
So in our book, the book I mentioned before, The Nature of Goods and the Goods of Nature, we try to really give the reader access to the full picture or a broader view on the impact of globalization. And in particular, we argue that we often miss the long-term view. Closing borders may be very detrimental in the long run. history and economic history research shows that countries that have closed borders have subsequently had worse economic outcomes for future generations. It is also something that hurts individuals. If you trust people less today, you're going to exchange less in the future with others, and this is going to hurt society a level of trust. And trust has been shown by economists to be a very important factor. So closing up today is detrimental both for current generations, but for future generations as well.
Okay, and that's what your book discusses?
It talks a lot about this historical persistence and how, when we think about the transmission of values, we think about vertical transmissions from parents to their children, from teachers or professors to the student, and also among peers. And the dynamics of cultural openness or closing is very important for economic exchange. And the book re-emphasizes this role of culture, institutions, but also values in how we succeed or fail as an economy.
Okay, great. I'm just going to check and see if we have any questions from the audience. We do. The first one we have here is, if we look at Brexit as an example, can you pinpoint some of the negative consequences of anti-globalization?
So as you know, today there's a lot of news going on about Brexit, so I don't know if the deal is going to be accepted. I don't have a crystal ball, but what we can say already is we see that there is an issue of knowledge flows, and there is an issue also when people voted Brexit, they didn't really know what was the deal going to be, and now there is a discussion, should we vote again, should we vote on the deal? So it shows that the ties that nations can make are deep, they are hard to break. It's hard to have a clean separation because our ties are visible and invisible as well. So,
okay, all right. I have another question for you. How has the rise of identity politics happened so quickly?
I think the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 played a big part in developing these identity politics. We've seen it in many countries. I believe that when politicians do not have the ability to make promises, because in a recession or in a crisis, it's hard for politicians to be credible and to promise things they cannot accomplish, they are going to be less likely to be believed, then playing on the identity card is going to allow them to have some way to channel voting support with an agenda that is not something that we can measure or quantify. Identity is a very diffuse concept, and therefore I think the financial crisis and the economic downturn explains part of this rise in identity politics.
Okay, let me check and see if we have any other questions from the audience. If not, I have one last question for you. Besides the goods of nature and the nature of goods, are there other economic concepts that support globalization?
We discuss in the book the historical persistence, how what we are today, what we eat today, what we do today is actually the testimony of our ancestors' exchanges. And sometimes what we believe is our identity is the testimony of our ancestors' trade, flows of ideas, flows of people and goods. And so it is important to keep in mind that, and we talk a lot about this in the book.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Thank you very much, Estefania, for joining us.
Thank you.
Remember that the replay will be available on ESSEC's YouTube account, so don't hesitate to share it, especially on Twitter with the hashtag EKLive. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.